Okay.
Go straight in.
Hey
Excellent.
everyone, thanks for coming to this workshop. We're super excited today to have Corey Moen and Timothy Ricks talking to us about variables, a very big subject and still pretty fresh to Webflow. So I'm really excited that everyone's going to be able to listen to their expert opinions on it and ask questions. So I think we're going to start with some intros, although those two don't need any intros, but we'll do it anyways. Corey Moen is the staff brand designer at Webflow, as well as a freelance Webflow tech lead and the co-founder of No Code Supply, a digital general store of no code inspiration, code, tools, resources, and more. And Timothy Ricks is the founder of the Wizardry Method and master Webflower, empowering other Webflow devs with the latest advanced low code and code techniques, such as variables. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Um,
Mhm. Yes, I think we're all
and
quite
yeah, I don't know if
excited
Tim
here.
says before we start.
Uh, I don't know. I am thrilled that you're both here, and actually just this workshop to Maggie because I have a feeling my connection's not very good today, but I was struggling. I don't go into Webflow all the time, and when I had gone in, I did not know what to do with variables, and I think they keep adding new things you can do with variables, and I'm totally lost. So thanks for being here.
Thanks for
All
having
right.
us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Also, still lost, so we'll figure it out together.
Yeah, that's the
Okay,
thing.
all right. I don't feel so bad.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think we're all, yeah, even the experts are kind of still figuring it out as well. But you're still ahead of us. So, yeah, Corey, do you wanna get started and show us a little bit?
Yeah, totally. I'm so sorry. I'm clicking things, still getting things open. I can maybe I'll start high level on just variables, and I guess where my brain and context comes and familiarity or not with them. And then I can show a little bit, at least in the regards with Mast. While that's opening up. So yeah, variables. I guess background for me, before ever discovering Webflow and my life improving exponentially since, I dabbled in other products, website builders, WordPress, Drupal, whatever. But dabble being the exceptional word there. I've just like learned code over the years, not formally. And variables was one of those things that I remember like messing with lightly with CSS pre Webflow, and I had the idea of like I get the value here of reusability, and I have a color and I can use the color everywhere now and change it once. Honestly, it's the same essence that I love about CSS itself, right? Is the reusability and efficiency that comes with that. And so then fast forward to like, more recently when variables have come into Webflow, and even more so like when they were introduced in Figma, and just design system thinking in general, embracing those code originated ideas into, design and all that. But even since then, when variables first launched last fall, I think like I was candidly very excited because it's another CSS concept we now get natively in Webflow. So that is going to mean power. But I think the other side of it that I was hesitant about is there still felt like there was things not quite there yet. Like we couldn't set a variable to change its value based on breakpoints, or they're not all the possible units and things were available. And so I just kind of paused and like I was like, I'm excited to see how people use this, and I'll slowly hopefully have use cases where I feel like it's valuable. And then honestly, Timothy here always doing as he does and like leading innovation in this entire community. As soon as I saw some of the videos, Tim, that you put out like at January maybe, on like those first revs of variables in Lumos, I think that's for me honestly what really started to connect the dots of the value of that reusability. And I think let me start sharing my screen as I transition into just showing them in Webflow at this point. Window, y'all see it? The inevitable question. Cool.
We see it.
And so I think the last point I was going to make is like, the other thing I think about all the time is a lot of anything I've ever shared, including Mast, shared or worked on, it comes from a place of the projects, freelance or full-time wise, that I've worked on over the years, and what could make my life easier, or common things I see occur. And a very common thread through all of that is anticipating change, right? Like, it is inevitable. There's the joke of like the client saying, make the logo bigger, but like that is a joke with a real context of like, change happens. And I've found that the most valuable thing you can do for anybody you're collaborating with, whether it's a client or a team member, is be able to handle change quickly, right? Like, hey, we actually need to change that thing, and it's used everywhere on the site. I'm so sorry we didn't catch this, says somebody collaborating, and you're like, I got this. Like, 3 clicks later, it's done, is the ultimate, whole managing design and development, in my opinion. And so I think variables is just like that next layer of that capability. And so, yeah, in Mast, I think the main area that I thought, after seeing some of Tim's content, that we could at least take a first step in using it was style guide setup. So for anybody watching that, maybe isn't familiar with Mast or Lumos or frameworks in Webflow in general, maybe that's helpful. I'll give like a TLDR on that, is that in Webflow, just like in traditional development, right, we can start from somewhere. We can start from a template or a theme or a framework or whatever to help us get going faster and work more consistently and efficiently, right? And so in Webflow, the way that comes to life is instead of it being, a link to an external CSS file like you would see in traditional development, maybe you actually just usually have all these pre-built classes and structure built out in a clonable Webflow project that you can clone and then start building from and modify it for your use case, right? So, in these style guides, no matter the framework, you usually are, outlining what's the typography, the heading sizes, paragraph sizes, colors, text colors, components like buttons and forms, etc., right? And these are those elements and aspects of literally any website will always need, right? Every website needs a button. Every website needs an H1 and a paragraph, right? And so the point is they have this predefined intention to build quicker with, right? And so the process of cloning that project is sometimes it's handy, but it's also for me like a little annoying to like, then, all right, I cloned it. Now I got to go start updating all of these fonts, all of these heading sizes, all the colors, everything to match the specific client project that I'm working on at that moment. And it takes a while, and there's a lot of room for error. So like, for example, if I'm updating headings, I have to make sure that I update the heading both on the class and the corresponding element, and do it consistently on every single breakpoint. And so I can't tell you the amount of times I've missed one and don't catch it till like the site's already live or halfway through the build or whatever. And so enter variables as even that problem alone, a way to solve that a bit more elegantly. So if I scroll down through some of these here, just to get to the point of the heading, now if I have H1s that are styled on both the element and the class, I can just have this one bare bones set of parameters that are almost always properties being adjusted across projects. I can set them in one place and know with confidence they are now updated across all use cases, being the HTML H1 element and the class, H1 class, right? And so it's already reducing error. It's saving me time too, because I can literally just update these in a matter of, I don't know, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, which is much, much, much faster than, going in here, manually clicking in, going to the next tablet, manually adjusting this, going here, manually adjusting this, now going back, right? And so I think hopefully that's helpful. Just like, that's a lot of where I was seeing some of this potential with variables as a starting point, at least, because the thing I will say is like, this, I think Mast is a pretty basic implementation of variables, really just covering headings, paragraph sizes, common components like buttons and card and input, and only really a lot of the like type oriented values, or maybe the occasional padding or border radius, really all things that I found I'm changing from project to project almost every time. with the nuance being that there's other aspects like buttons that, while sure, it's easy to set these valuable values here, I think there was other things that like I still am unsure about, honestly, in that like if I'm styling a button and adjusting, you know, like on hover, what happens right now? It's this like default darkening, but like should it have like a wipe of color or go to an outline, or what, you know, that changes so often that I just at this moment I was like, maybe that's still just handled in the style panel as we've always done. And then there's a future rev of variables that, you know, enables that more holistically. But yeah, I'll stop there to not talk too long and have Timothy go as well, and then we can get into questions. But before I do, is there any questions initially, or yeah? Cool.
Yeah, I'm trying to look at the YouTube at the same time. It just people are saying that it's interesting to see how the font weight is set up. Do you want to maybe talk about that a little bit?
It's Tim, not me. So that is 100% copied from Lumos, and Tim, your approach, and really is maybe a good point in that. Maybe let me share my screen real quick again, just to show the visual reference of what I was going to say. Is that, you know, when you go to create a variable in Webflow, there are options on the type of variable, size, color, font family. You will notice there is no font weight though. And while you can maybe use size, there is no way, if I scroll down to what they maybe saw here, there is no way to set a unitless size, which is what CSS requires for setting the value of a font weight. And so the workaround here is that for now, hopefully there will be a font weight variable at some point in the future, and we don't even need this, right? But that shouldn't be a reason to just not use variables at all. So the workaround, again, cleverly that Tim came up with, was you can set all the possible font weight values here, 1 through 900, just leave their value as essentially nothing or the default 0 pixels. And then in an embed, which is, this is pretty common anymore in people building in Webflow, is that you have an embed with maybe some custom CSS used everywhere on the site. And so in here, we can basically reset the value of each of those variables to the actual unit or the actual value we want, which is a unitless 100, 200, 300, and so on. And quickly, I think one other thing to point out here that I also get, like, when variables finally came to Webflow, I was over the moon that it was actually CSS variables. In other words, not only are you creating them and reusing them visually in the UI, but you can get the actual CSS value of that variable here and then use it now in an embed like that, or in custom properties, or in anywhere else in custom code. So it's literally creating this connection, this relationship between, you know, a variable that is just built by clicking buttons in Webflow and code that you're doing something else with, which is like epically powerful, and actually maybe a really great segue to Tim and, you know, a lot more of the ways that like Lumos leverages it, even with theming and stuff like that, which I think is so awesome. So yeah, great question.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Corey. It's always exciting to see how everyone's using variables, and I
100%.
think there's a lot of great stuff we can all learn. Yeah, and I would say on that, redefining variables too, like there's so many ways you can do that. Like any unit that Webflow doesn't support, like fluid typography or clamps or 100% width, max width, none, those are all variables you can still create in the panel and then update their value in code. So just because Webflow doesn't support it currently doesn't mean we can't use it. But yeah, I'll just share very briefly the high level of where I'm at with variables right now. So yeah, I think one thing that a lot of people wonder is what's the difference between, you know, like a page padding sort of class that we reuse everywhere for maybe some horizontal padding throughout our site, or just like, why would I use a variable for this when I can just create a class and have the same global updates? And the main reason for that is being able to change and override things across breakpoints. So a very common UX pattern is like a nav menu, which I might be able to drop in a basic nav bar here if they have one. And so usually in the menu, right, we don't want any sort of left and right padding. And then on mobile, when this menu opens up to full screen, we want this menu, we want the left and right padding usually to match the padding we're using elsewhere throughout the site. So it's breakpoint specific. So that's a great use case for variables, is when we need to add a style inside a certain breakpoint. Another thing is like I often create a font weight or font family too. If I have like a secondary, maybe italic or serif font family, and we could of course create like a font family to utility and just use that anywhere throughout our site. Or font family secondary, you might want to call it. But that doesn't solve it when, say, we hover over a link and we need to adjust the font family, right? Because you can't add a utility just on hover. So this is where having those things saved in variables gives you more flexibility than just using a utility class, because we're able to adjust it across breakpoints, only in a hover, only inside a rich text, different things like that. That really speed up our workflow and make our site more consistent than if we just weren't using it in general. So yeah, just as far as variable goes, there's like I have some basic things just for color of a button, for instance, but I don't take it so far as like the button border radius or button font weight or things like that. And I think that really just depends on how you want to work. Like there's no right or wrong to any of this stuff. But for instance, for my buttons, at least, I might have a play button that has, and I think I might have my regular buttons that have like a different border radius, and I can just pull a smaller one here. And these are just like global things. So I'm saving all the different radius sizes that I'm using throughout my site, but I'm not naming it per component. These are just general styles that can be used on anything. So this might be used in a card or on a nav bar or something like that. So I might have this main button throughout my site that has one radius, and I might have, you know, a slider arrow that's more of a pill, and I might have a play button that's more of a circle. So yeah, there's lots of ways to do things, and you can either name styles globally or you can name them per component. The same thing applies to color. The same thing applies to any kind of style you create. Is we need to decide, do we want this to be global style or component specific? And you can even have a component style that references a global style. So within my button folder, I could create a size for something like button radius, and then that could reference all the global radius values that we're using throughout the site too. So there's lots of different ways to think through this stuff and handle it. But yeah, and I think some of the main things that I like to use variable fors right now, at least, are typography related things. I'll have things that are specific to the H6, for instance, the H1, but I'll have a layer on top of that that's more global, with like the font family for the site as the whole and the font weights for that family. And that's where I was talking about like a secondary family or things like that. So global styles that are connected to individual element styles. And I'll do the same thing with line heights. These are all global line heights that could be used across any sort of heading element or things like that. I have global pre-adaptive sizes that will just reduce on each breakpoint, but then I take that a step further and start using those for the font sizes of elements. And again, for spacing, to space apart elements within a section, I have a whole space folder, which is right here, and that's referencing those global sizes that are used for everything throughout the site. So it gives you a lot of consistency, because you know everything's kind of adapting at a similar rate, but you're able to narrow down specific things like section top and bottom padding that can reference global variables somewhere else. So yeah, that's really high level overview, but hopefully that gives some context into different ways of thinking about variables.
This is awesome. Okay, so we do have a few comments here. So here, this is one from, I don't know if you see the chat there. Christian saying, "Hey Timothy, I have seen you use a lot of combo classes. I don't like how Webflow handles this, so I'm using combo element and make it a component and add all the combo classes." Actually, it's, yeah, I don't know if you want to answer that one. Maybe we're going a bit away from the variables, but
Yeah, so combo classes, and you said you're using them on a component. Is that through the class attribute, the new class attribute?
maybe let me look
No.
if there's another one that's more variables related.
Yeah.
This one might be more about memos. You know what? Let's just, I don't see a ton. So let's just go into a more general question. So what, tell us a bit about maybe some of the limitations, and then we'll go back into, and then we'll talk about why variables over classes.
No. I can start. So I noted at least a start of the limitations. I think like units and even the types of variables. And I think like a bigger one that's maybe interesting to talk about is like we mentioned earlier Figma, right? The vast majority of us, I don't want to say everybody, but the vast majority are probably working in Figma and Webflow, right? Design's probably happening in Figma, course building in Webflow, and there's more and more variable functionality in Figma as well as Webflow. Like Figma, was it last week, just launched type, being able to set variables on typography in Figma natively. And then I know even Tim, you've used another plugin, right, to be able to control more values. And so I think there's something interesting there around like if that's a big aspect of the ultimate goal, being able to control a consistent system in Figma that you can in Webflow, and maybe even one day sync it all happily together. And right now, I would say that to me, when I hear limitations, is probably one of the biggest areas of limitations, and that like that's the dream, but there's a lot of limits to make that perfect in the meantime. It doesn't mean you can't do a lot still, right? Again, especially if you do use like a plugin or something like that. But I think that's the part I'm hoping for. And so to be more clear on even like an example of that limitation is in Figma, when you set the font size of an H1, as my example earlier, to whatever, 32 pixels, you can't say, no, that should actually be 2 rem in Figma. It's only pixels. Like dev mode in Figma, you can inspect as rem, but like that doesn't really help us, right? And so I think that's a big aspect that hopefully we will get a better way to translate that. And then similarly, even in Webflow, in terms of units like that, like you can't set unit lists anymore. I talked about that, I guess, in the aspect of font weight, but I also think about it as like, I feel old school in that like anytime I set line height, I want to use just like 1.1, unit list, like not M's or whatever, but like, honestly, we don't have that in variables. So even the line height variables in Mast are using M because it's ultimately the same thing. It's equivalent in what it will do. But just not, we don't have full support of all those. And I think even some of the context there, I think is probably just safeguarding things like, in Webflow, if it was just, you could use any unit you want, then it might end up with people using a unit list or some unit on some property that actually is not valid CSS, right? So I think that's something to note there, where like sometimes people are like, why does Webflow limit these stuff? It's like a lot of the times it's for your own safety, your own happy bowling bumpers, to make sure that whatever you're making is clean, semantic, valid HTML and CSS. Even if it's in realms you're unsure about, right? And similarly, you can see that even with the custom properties and some of the validation that happens there. So I don't know, Tim, what do you think? Other limitations on variables and some of that?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on all the main ones. I'd love to see transition duration as the variable one day too. That'd be cool.
And I mean, to that point, you already noted earlier, now that you say that way, I think even just calcs and things like that as the value of variables would be really nice, right? Because you can kind of reset them, but it'd be nice to just be able to do it, especially since we can do it in custom properties. One other one I think we touched on maybe pre-chat was modes. In Figma, you can create modes. So if you think about the variables in the one column view of, we have, H1 and it's 32 pixels on desktop. In Figma, you can say, all right, now I want a new mode for tablet and a new mode for mobile landscape and a new mode for mobile portrait. And I can adjust what the value changes to on each one of those. Hopefully we get that in Webflow, especially in the reality that like, it's just a media query, at least if it was, bound to breakpoints, right? I think my uncertainty or wonder though is like, could modes be more, right? Can it be open-ended, kind of like Figma's doing, where it doesn't have to just be bound to breakpoints. It could be bound to color themes, right? Like light and dark, or other things like that. So yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. Lots of opportunity, I think, is the positive. Yeah. Is there
So
other
someone, someone was asking actually, Timothy, if you could touch on that as well. If you could cover the typography panel's limits regarding variables, weight, text transforms, and so on. Like your opinion on it as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's really just text transform and font weight that aren't supported currently, are the main ones. So we can just update their values. That's what I'm doing on my project in an embed. And now that we have custom properties, we can apply it there, which I think, like in my custom code under here, I'm just updating like a regular Webflow variable from text transform uppercase, and it's set to 0 pixels in the variable panel, and I'm setting it to uppercase here instead. And that way, anytime I use that variable, it will, like if I were to grab this element and I come down to custom properties, which is down here, and it will actually already have a text transform, but if I just switch this to text transform uppercase, then it'll just reference that. And the reason for this is so that you could set your all H1 class and tag, like Corey was showing, to uppercase, or anytime you reference an H1 style on a certain breakpoint, hover state, nested inside an element, any of that, it would all be consistent because it's saved in a variable. But yeah, those are the two places. Font weight, you'll see we have to use custom properties for, and text transform until Webflow supports those natively.
I think Patrick has a question too in the here.
Yes, I did. Would you guys rather have like a more in-depth syncing system between Webflow and an external tool like Figma, or would you prefer to have a better way to build the design system directly in Webflow? Like, do you prefer a separation between dev and design environments when it comes to creating style systems? Because I know there's a lot of overlap there.
I can start. I think my take is, I think the source of truth should be in code. In other words, in Webflow. And I think we see this with what Figma just launched as well, Code Connect, that essentially is being able to associate components in Figma with their equivalent React, in this case, code, to use that component in a React build, right, in a React project. And I think the main key there, and maybe I can find the YouTube link on Figma's channel. I forget the dude's name, but I learned so much in one video of him walking through Code Connect, from simply the aspect of thinking about those sides, right? Design and code, where should the source of truth be? How should they interact? And I think there was a lot of great points he made around the source of truth needs to be in code for a lot of reasons. I think an obvious one is like the Figma to Webflow plugin. It not only will sync variables, will sync components, but like when you think about that, like there's a lot of components like a nav that have so many complex aspects to them that you'll just never be able to capture in something like Figma. But that shouldn't be a reason that we can't have this, like I've referred to it internally as like the magical rainbow bridge between design and development is what everybody's trying to build. Like, let's be real. And I don't think Webflow has even solved it yet, but that's the goal, is that there is just this seamless transition of magic between the two. But ultimately you have to start from somewhere. Like, I don't know if there will be a world, but maybe where it's like perfect harmony. And so hopefully that's helpful. I guess the way I think about it as like, I'm excited for all that potential, but I really think at some point Webflow is going to need to be the source of truth for those systems in a lot of ways. But I don't know, Tim, what do you think?
Yeah, that would be super cool. Like setting section padding or whatever variables in Webflow and having it sync back to Figma. In my workflow, like I'm usually developing the site, someone else is designing it, and there's not a lot of variable use in the design phase. Development is kind of like the cleanup phase. whereas design's more exploration and getting the ideas out. So I'll come back into the design and be like, there's 20 different top and bottom section padding values here. Can we like narrow it down? So that's usually the design to dev handoff. But like while I'm building the site, once we have that narrowed down, if that could be synced back to design, so while they're designing future pages, it follows that system. That would be really cool. So I guess, yeah, just focusing more on an easy way to build the system out in Webflow as opposed to syncing it all from Figma would be great.
Or what I'm hearing from both of you is that we just need to get all the designers to just jump right into Webflow. Like, just forget Figma, just design your style systems right in Webflow.
No.
I think I wanted to even push on that. I think that's such a good point too of this conversation is what Tim just said around like the reality is that like variables are all well and good, but there's a lot of gaps if you don't do both the design and the development in a project. And like even if you can do both, I would say a lot of our experiences are probably, it depends, right? Like there's projects you might be dev only, there's projects you might be both, there's project maybe you're design only, right? And I know I had some conversations around this even with like, I shared a video I remember with Corey Runnels and Matt Evans and a couple people in the community that I know have like tried Mast, and the Loom was around, you know, the Figma to Webflow plugin, and you can use like a command, is it Command Shift V to like paste and use classes already in a project to like start to get to this copy paste workflow that's defined first in Figma. But the major issue that I think all of them had feedback with is like, yeah, that's if the perfect world is the Figma design or Figma files, like named layers and variables, that's not real, yo. Like I do design and development every single day at Webflow, and I don't even name layers. Or honestly, we're still barely getting to the point of using variables more holistically. And so like there is something there, I don't know, in that. Like, how do we use and leverage these tools in the nuances of those collaborations with, you know, designers or developers in a way that's like consistent and reliable, right? Like, I don't know. Even the way you said it, Tim, I was like, that's interesting of like, yeah, does it need to be a cleanup phase? Could it not be like, let's talk about this first, I'll set all the variables in Webflow, sync them to Figma, then you design with those. So that way, once design's done, I already know we're good to roll really fast, right? Super interesting. I don't know.
Okay, so yeah, there's actually some questions about custom properties, but as maybe I'll ask one newbie question, and because the two of you have been diving like deep right away, and I think there's a lot of people with different levels that are watching this stream. So I was wondering, is there like an entry for those who are just getting into it? Is there an entry level way to use the variables that you would recommend to not be put off right away and not just turn away from variables?
Yeah, I was almost thinking if you could just start with a blank project and then just show setting up a few variables and then using a couple things just so that people could see what that process is if they're not starting from a framework that already has variables set up. That would be great.
And what would you recommend to use it on, like in just like a few things to use it on when you start out, maybe like not go straight into, you know, into more complicated, yeah, go ahead.
Tim, you want to do it?
Okay. Yeah. Let's see. Can y'all see this screen, the Webflow? The classic question.
Yeah,
Okay,
you're
cool. Yeah, one thing, and I actually funny you say that because I just went into a client build today that was built before variables, and we were extending it, and it didn't have anything in there, and I started just adding stuff into the variable panel as I built, and even finding things that were already built out and trying to create variables for them. So one thing I think pretty much every project will have is a border width variable, at least one. So you can create a size variable, and you could say, you could say border width, and maybe it's like 1.5 pixels or something. And so everywhere you go to apply a border width normally, Like maybe I'll wrap this in a div, and maybe we'll say this is our header. Maybe it has some bottom padding, and maybe it should have a bottom border, right? So we would come over to border width, we would attach it to the bottom, and we'd just grab our variable. So instead of typing it, we would just click it right there. And so now we have that border width. So if we decide to change it one day, we have that freedom to adjust it here. So for example, let's say we have a button, and let's say this is our outline button, and I'm sure there's better ways to name this, but so let's grab the border width and apply it to all sides of this button. And let's go ahead and clear out that. And let's go ahead and add in, had to re-enter this. Let's see, inherit, there we go. And so, yeah, so now we have that border width attached to the bottom border of this div and to all sides of this div. So if we come back later and decide this actually needs to be 3 pixels, it's updated everywhere. And that's just like a high level. So a lot of times we'll have a border width, different sizes of border width, and that's when I would create a folder. So border width slash whatever you want to call it, small, main, anything like that. And that'll just put this in a folder. And then we can have another one for slash large. So, and that way you could start to group different styles. So maybe this is our small border width, this is our large one that we're using. And that way you can have different variations within the same property. And it makes it easier to search. So like if I have, one thing I did do with mine was, so if I have a size and I have a border radius, and it could follow the same convention, right? So like a small might be like a 0.5 rem. The main border radius we're using throughout our site might be 1 rem. And maybe we have like a large or something that's like 2.5 rem or something. One thing that I try to think through is how easy will it be to find this when I go to apply it. So if I grab this button, and I like to search by the folder name a lot. So if I go to apply this and type border, the first thing that comes up is width, and I have to type out the full radius. So it's not super fast to apply. I guess I could just do it, search radius like this, but what I actually did was just rename the whole folder to just be radius. And that way I don't have to worry about like if I type border, 2 different things showing up. And that way I can just choose, do I want this button to use the small radius or the main one? Oops, there we go. Whoops, what did I do? There we are. Oh, I'm applying this to my container instead of the button. Yeah, radius, come on. There we go. All right. Yeah, and so we have that. And the other thing that I think every project will need is probably padding, left and right padding for your sections or containers throughout the site, and top and bottom padding for your sections. So pretty much I could say with confidence, every project will need that. So that's just a size variable and whatever you want to call it. I call mine padding horizontal. And I like to only use one. So I'll just call this main. You might have different sizes of that. You might have a large or whatever, but I like to just use one and just reuse that everywhere so that my grids are aligned with that. And actually what I just learned today, or a coworker of mine showed me this last week, is I always thought you had to click here, click on this, and maybe y'all know this, click here, click on this, but you can actually, once this is highlighted, do Option Enter or Shift Enter right into this field, and it will apply across all sides. And I did not know that before. It would have saved so much time. But that's a quick way to just apply variables. Yeah, like if I did this and do Option Enter, then it's going to apply across the top and bottom of this thing. But yeah, hopefully that's a high level of how to get started. Just set up the most common things you'll use, like your left and right padding, your top and bottom padding, border width, any common styles you'll reuse a lot throughout your design. That would be the most important.
Right. So essentially, you start from what is the, what is the what's what's the word? It's not that we're changing the element. We're not starting from the element. We're starting from the what you're applying to the element. So choosing size or color, and then you set up where you're going to apply that.
Right. Yep.
Got it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Core
Yeah.
styles.
Yeah. Another way I like to think about it too is like in that time-saving, less room for error mentality I mentioned a little bit earlier, is like the border radius one I think is a great example, or the border. They're both great examples of like, I know in the design that, you know, we use these all over. Maybe the card has a border radius and the button has a border radius, right? And so I want to make sure I'm consistent, and I want to ideally not have to remember that myself, right? Because then like, what if you remember wrong or whatever? And so it's like the thing I love about it is like the surefire way that's like, here's my border radius options. This is all it could be. And so it just like, it's less cognitive load is one way that could be expressed, right? Like you can work so much quicker once those things are set, ideally. And I think the other thing too is like, I love those examples out of this mindset of like, we often talk about, you know, using utility classes or not. And like variables just now makes that a little more approachable, that like maybe that you don't even need to make that decision all the time, because you can use that same unit or value across multiple custom classes, right? So you still have that reusability in some respect. But yeah.
Also, I just want to mention, like, along the same vein, like now that you both touched on it, is just the less clicks. Like the fact that you can just tap V and edit a value, as opposed to open the navigator, click the item, scroll down to the element, click the value, click into it, make an edit, hit enter, right? Now it's open the variable panel, maybe search for something, maybe click it right away and just edit it. Like you could see, like, just watching you both run through stuff, how much quicker it is when, you know, you can just edit stuff, as opposed to there's immediate value there, as opposed to, you know, classes like completely having to edit all the classes notwithstanding, right? Just, you know, having that variable that you can just tick, right, adjust the value. It's like, it's should not be, you know, glossed over, like understated. It's such a huge time saver.
Yeah. I think it's one of those things to just get used to too, like, not to go down this rabbit hole, but the new style panel updates were, you know, mixed feedback. But fast forward a month and I think, you know, people, you just get used to it. And it's another tool that the more you at least start with simple examples and then use it maybe a little more and a little more, like it might become just kind of second nature. I don't know. Yeah. Cool.
Actually, I had another question about how in Mast, how the spacing utilities are set up, and I'm wondering if, like, did you choose that approach? So like, it's like, so the spacing utilities in Mast, you got, like, you start at like 0.25 rem and you can go all the way up to like 8 rem, and similarly with EMs, you have, you know, 0.5 EM up to 3. Did you choose to do that so it's like more, you know, adaptable to someone's system? Like, if you were building that again just completely for yourself, would you eliminate those spacing utility rems and have specific, like, dedicated padding, or you know, specific dedicated sizes?
Yeah, great question. I will start by saying, actually, I just had a project 2 weeks ago that started, and I was already like, man, this could be better. So let me first point out what you're talking about. So in Mast, you know, if you go into variables, and then there are 2 different types of predefined spacing. The first one, I was just like, I think thinking smooth brain about like, all right, yeah, we have all of our base utilities. So again, try to keep in the mindset of like, if you're not familiar with Mast or even frameworks, these being utility classes that you can add and remove. So an example is like, if I have a paragraph and I don't know, another element under it that is a card, and maybe, I don't know, card body. I was just trying to have some things for you to visually see. BG dark gray, sweet. And then I'm like, oh, when I'm in the process of building this out, I want this to be more space. I can just like add on a utility to add more space, right? And the reason that like, and we get, honestly, I would say people don't often like it's just my preference. So it's cool, y'all. Like, I don't know. I love using M's for utility spacing because like, an M unit, if you aren't familiar, is a value associated to the element or its parent's font size. And so the benefit is like, I can add M be 2 to the title here or this, and you can see the amount of spacing is different, which in some minds is like, that is whack. And I can totally see that perspective. The part I like about it is then responsibly, as these font sizes get smaller, the amount of space naturally gets smaller. And I'm just explaining that out of the difference of like, so we have these M's that are set by default on all these different margin bottom, margin top, in masked. And so the idea is that like, if you had a design system or a Figma design you were given or you made, and in general everything is spaced out more generously, or the opposite, more narrow, right? Then in theory you could come in and just say, I want all 1M values to now be 0.5, and I want all 0.5 to be 0.25. But again, this is where I'm like, man, I don't think this works because then the unit itself, like the name should probably change, because right now they're equivalent. So I think that's that one. Again, that I feel like could be better. The utility rem here, the thinking was also seeing like the way Tim and some others have started handling adding space to anything at scale, and having in that, this was really out of that mindset of what I was describing about like reducing cognitive load. I just don't, what are the options and the narrow amount of options that I have? And I want to try to reuse those everywhere I can. And so the purpose of these is more for the common use case of custom classes. So Mass takes the mindset that like the pre-built classes you see in here, including all these utilities and helper classes and layout system, these will maybe get you 80% of the way there, but you always are going to need custom classes. That's just the reality of like building things that are bespoke and specific for a specific need. And so if I was, you know, making some, I don't know what an example would be, like magic card, I don't know, for some specific reason, then, you know, I can then grab spacing and use one of the predefined values that are used elsewhere on the site, but in a custom class. Similarly to what Tim was saying for the little hot tip, you can also like hold Option or Shift and just click or hit enter either way. And then like, I think that the thing that's nice here as well that I've started to use and felt is handy is like, I can also still control these across breakpoints as I want. So if magic card should be a smaller top bottom padding here, I could just adjust it down, but still know that I'm reusing a common value across the system. So that was the thinking in it. Again, I don't know that it's perfect, especially as I've started to use it more in actual projects, is really where I feel like I learned the most around what's useful, what's not, what doesn't need to be there. I think that's another thing I try to always remind myself of, is like, what's the bare minimum, and anything else that's needed. Hopefully there's an obvious way how to add that, because it's in a consistent way with how other things are created. So yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It's cool to see you like the fact that you potentially would change like the value of the variable, but keep the variable name the same and like have that discrepancy. Like I was like starting to do that, and I was like, is this how it's meant to be used? Is it not? But then I also found myself like, you know, for the spacing rem, a lot of times I would, okay, like I was doing a build with images that were really spaced apart. So I was like, maybe I'll just make instead of having like that variable attached to this specific image class, maybe I'll just have like UMB8. And I created one, and I was like, and then I guess I'll tie the 8 rem value to it. I was like, is that how it's supposed to be used too? So then I was like, okay, so but it's about adaptability to this as you kind of this too.
And I think one thing to note even on that is like, and maybe this goes into even if you're just getting started with variables, is and Timothy also like noted this, naming is important. If Matt Evans is or isn't watching, shout out, because we've had endless DMs on Twitter about this and how to name things. So A, what Timothy showed, you can find them quickly when you need them, and then B, so that like they're organized in some way in here. I really deeply hope we can manually reorder these at some point in the future. Come on, Webflow. So that, because right now they're just alphabetical order is maybe a thing to keep in mind when you are naming your variables. They just force an alphabetical, and part of my way to try to get around that was adding like more explanation, like colors and colors here, so that these are grouped together, right? But it's still not ideal, because I think it's weird that like, I don't like that component button comes first, but I was like, you know what, this works for now. Again, it's a starting point and it's better than no point. And so, yeah, naming is hard, but I think that's part of the fun and the strategy of it, right? Is like what works well for you. And where I was going with that, Patrick, is like, I think there's some people that absolutely would prefer this to be like SM, MD, LG, XL, so that the name is abstracted away from the value. So if you change these values, you don't need to change the names still work. And honestly, I go back and forth on that still of like, should this be UMT, SM? I don't know. I don't want to go too far into the nuances unless y'all really are interested in that, I think. But like naming in general is just a challenge in code, period. No matter if you're writing HTML or maybe not HTML as much, but CSS, JavaScript, etc. Naming is hard. And that's why other frameworks and things exist like Tailwind even to try to ignore it. But I get nerdy about it. I think it's fun. I think it really impacts your workflow, and it's also subjective. So, you know, everybody has their own preference of how they like to read and find and discover and use things. And so ultimately, like making a system that works for many, but knowing that it's never going to work for everybody. That's just not a thing.
Yeah. And it's like it falls into like because you can see like when you're doing like columns, like you have column large and medium and small and extra small, and it makes sense in that case because that's what they're dependent on. But it's so hard to stray away from like I want one M or one rem top padding like UMT1. Like how can you get cleaner than that, right? Like
yeah.
syntax,
And even
like,
the
syntax,
nuance.
right?
The nuance of abbreviations or not, right? Like MT isn't obvious. So should it be spelled out or not? I don't know. These are all the things that I personally find really fun about frameworks because it's like a video game of like, how are you going to get to the end? But some people I get, it's like, I don't want that. Just tell me what to do. And I respect that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I know like similarly here, so I'd like to ask another question, but I know like Timothy, like in Lumos, you go hard in the abbreviations, right? Like, and then I guess that's just to reduce on like, is the thinking there like it takes a little bit longer to like get going with it, but then at the end it speeds up your workflow? Is that like the main goal there?
Yeah, I mean, I really don't use many abbreviations anymore, but when I did, it was because I was using nested classes, like a class inside of a class, so it had to keep that really short. But the newest version of Lumos, everything's pretty much spelled out. There's no really abbreviations. But yeah, we could go back and forth on that for sure too.
There's one question from Kenneth that I find is really interesting because I'm having this is where my confusion comes from. He says, it depends on how you're using variables. If multiple elements are sharing the same variable, they'll need to scale down the same way, which may not always be the case. That's the issue that I have too, is that like even for margins, are we thinking that because it's great for making changes globally, but yeah, margins might change depending on the element, and then like, wouldn't it be easier for that case to just use classes?
I mean, I think it's subjective because like even though you use variables like the spacing rem ones, for example, like if you had those, if you were using those as I was showing, you can still change to use a different variable on a different breakpoint if it needs to dynamically change, right? I think it's just the nuance too of like what I think about is like what is the preference of yourself or the team you're working with. An example is like transparently on the brand team at Webflow, our own framework internally is called Boilerplate. It's very similar to Mast, but has differences. And we used to have default bottom margin on all type and things like that, like you'll find in Mast. But we talked about it as a team, and it's just uncomfortable. And there was edge cases where it didn't make sense. And so we agreed and shifted to zeroing out, right? And that's just an example, maybe not as directly as what the question is. But the point is that like, I think even that is like, it's very use case dependent. And so I think it's more about having a system or a way that you work that you know is hopefully flexible to whatever your use case is, but then has that overarching consistency for your efficiency of working and even, you know, instructing somebody else on how something's built. Yeah, I guess.
Penny, do you want to read Eric's question there, or yeah? So Eric was asking with. Oh, go ahead.
No. Go ahead. I'm just posting them in there so that you've got access
yeah.
to them.
Yeah, Eric was asking with Maston, beginning a new project, should I go straight to editing my variables or style guide?
Yeah, the idea is that your starting point is variables, and it takes the heaping assumption that these values have been defined in Figma. So an example is like really, hopefully, I think, anybody that's designing the site in Figma, to Timothy's point, spacing is probably the most like variant thing that's not used consistently in Figma, unless like somebody's really hardcore about literally everything being auto layout. But at least hopefully they're using type styles so that all headings are the same consistent usage, and they're using the same colors from color styles or variables in Figma. And so the idea is that those things are assumed to be already set there. And so when you clone Mast, you just open it up and go right into the variables panel and just start updating all those values to match Figma. I think that, yeah, the grander vision too is that, again, hopefully one day the plugin will be even more epic. And I'm working on like about finally finishing up a version of the Mast style guide, but in Figma, that you'll find consistent. Like Tim, I think you have one for Lumos. There's a client first one. A lot of those have those as that reference. And so I just don't, time is escaping always. So that's almost ready out of the point of that like, hopefully that even will make it easier that you'll have that exact one-to-one reference in Figma for the most part, to make that step simple. So yeah.
Well, we're almost at time there. So can I ask the both of you to do maybe a little outro, like your general thought about, like, yeah, maybe a summary of what you think about variables?
Go for it,
yeah, Timothy, go start. Yeah, maybe go ahead.
Man, where do I start? Yeah, I mean, I think they're really awesome. I think using them more is important. Like, and I think don't be scared about them. Corey was mentioning this before the call. Is like, be afraid to try different things, and if it doesn't work, it's okay, and find the workflow that works best for you. Yeah, and no matter what, having some variables in your project is better than none, just because it's going to help with the consistency and faster workflow. So just start by adding some things that you see are reused most often throughout your project. If you're like, this is my third or fourth or fifth time applying this style, then maybe just create a variable for it. And yeah, that's my thought.
Love it. Plus one. A couple other things I think we didn't touch on that I would encourage people to just at least play around with for fun, if nothing else. I barely have recently started was you can change variable values with interactions in Webflow. And I think that it's also a little hard to wrap my brain around, but there's a lot of interesting use cases for that are both just for animation sake or even functional sake of wanting to change something or show something in a specific consistent way. So check that out. And then, yeah, major plus one. I think that, like, again, I hope it's empathetic in that, like, I also was intimidated or even just like took some time to get into it. But I really think this is the essence of building on the web, y'all. Like, I think that's what I love about it over like coming from a static print type background in graphic design first out of university is like, that's fine, but it doesn't change very often versus the web that changes daily. There's new tools, there's new approaches, there's new ideas, and that is what's exciting about it. So I think variables is probably in that same bucket of like, it's just one of those things that I think it's good to at least give it a try, understand it, even if you don't want to use it completely entirely right out the gate. At least get your feet wet and give it a shot, and you can always change it. That's the other beauty of it. Print is permanent. There's no going back from printing 5,000 something. Web, you publish the wrong thing, cool, fix it, republish it, the world is fine, no one's hurt otherwise. So always remember that with any new feature, right? So yeah, thanks so much for having us, yo. So awesome.
Oh, thank you so much for coming. And yeah, I would say, like, you use it at least for colors and typography. And one thing I'll say is it is really cool to look at like some of the tutorials that Tim has where he uses it for animation. We haven't talked about it too much because that's pretty advanced, but that's where they really shine as well. Like for consistency across a big project and for animation, it's really fun to look at what you can do with variables. So since this is the end, maybe can you also just say where we can find the both of you? Maybe Tim, we'll start with you. Where can people find you on the internet?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, Timothy Ricks, YouTube, Timothy Ricks, and Instagram, Tim Ricks. So that's
And
yeah,
of course,
gotta love that.
check out Wizardry if you don't know about it yet. Do you want to just do a quick, just a little, a small chat about what Wizardry is?
That was a framework, one of my first frameworks for Webflow before Lumos. But
Well, I guess
yeah,
Sorry. I think a lot of people still associate you with Wizardry, but
right.
yeah, or Lumos, or
Yeah, it's all good.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Right.
sorry. Yeah. Just because I think
But
a lot
you-
of people associate with general, like just wizardry being the techniques that you're presenting more
Yeah.
than the framework. But yeah.
That makes
Right.
sense.
But you do have a
Cool.
community where that people can
Yeah.
join and be
And with
learning
the-
from you.
Yeah, we're on Discord, and yeah, we just have a couple meetups each month and help each other out with problems and projects. So yeah,
Great. Cool.
cool.
Love it.
Corey?
Corey.
Major plus oneing for Timothy's YouTube. If you're not subscribed and hitting all notifications on Timothy, you're doing Webflow wrong. That's all I'll say. Because I think it's just Tim, I love every time there's a new one. I'm like, yes, something to watch tonight. Anyways, you can find me. I think I'm most active on Twitter, X, whatever, at Corey G Moen. I'm on LinkedIn. And yeah, check out No Code Supply Co. is a side project that I run with Max at Webflow Max. And so we just love, honestly, curating epic stuff that y'all make. And yeah, thank you so much again for having us.
Excellent.
Thank you so much for being here. This is awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. Maybe Jeremy, do you want to stop the